Morning, everybody. Happy hump day. It's nearly the end of the school holidays. And welcome to the News Agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox, with my News Agenda mug. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's Deputy Online Political Editor, Lizzie Buchan, who does not have her News Agenda merch. What have you... Oh, hang on. Lizzie's gone. Lizzie's gone, I've just been told. What a brilliant intro I just had. There she is. She's back again. I'm just saying, Lizzie, I'm here with my News Agenda mug and you're not. What have you got instead?
No, sorry for disappearing. I have got a very, quite a hard to find bit of merchandise from Liz Truss's 49 days as Prime Minister. We got this at Conservative Party conference in 2022 and I found it back at the cupboard and thought, why not?
Why is that at the back of it? For anyone on the podcast, it says Liz for leader on the outside. And of course, they're very rare because he only ever made 3 mugs and they soon got smashed. But
yeah, she was only PM for another couple of weeks and then...
Exactly. But why is that at the back of your cupboard? I'd be drinking out of it every goddamn day. If anybody's got a mug out there...
I will from now on. I think I'd forgotten that I had it. But yeah, so it's making its debut again this morning.
Good. Well, I'm glad to see it. I hope it should be on pride of place on your desk, I would have thought. If anyone out there has got a mug that says Susie Boniface for Prime Minister, let me know. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View. Please get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them. Those of you listening later on podcast are just going to have to demand a public inquiry and see how long it takes for you to get invited to speak there. So what have we got for you today? Well, speaking of public inquiries, the Mirror has splashed on the electrifying appearance yesterday of campaigning Subpostmaster Alan Bates at the Post Office inquiry, where he tore the organisation a new one. But then again, he did have to wait a good 20 years or whatever to be invited to express his view. More on that a bit later. But first, I want to take us to page 22, where there's been a court ruling which is going to have a dramatic impact on governments across Europe, maybe the world, and certainly here. Lizzie, can you take us through this? What's happened?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So a group of women in Switzerland have won their kind of first ever climate victory at the European Court of Human Rights. So they've said that their country's government has been effectively totally inadequate in meeting its targets to reduce emissions, and they say that I think these women are in their 70s, so they say that they're sort of particularly vulnerable because of their age and because of their gender to the impact of rising temperatures. Mm-hmm. So I think this is the first time that the ECHR has ruled on a case like this. So it's quite interesting on what the kind of fallout is, not only for Switzerland, but what it means for other countries in Europe as well that are bound by the ECHR, including Britain.
Right. So this is something that's not actually getting a lot of coverage in a lot of places, but it is going to have massive impacts and probably is worth a bit more attention than it is actually getting. I'll declare a bit of a bias about this. One of my journalism students has recently written a feature about people suing their own governments over climate change. So I was had a little bit of awareness about it to start with. When I saw this on page 22, I went, oh, that's interesting. There's been a win in the case. Now, there were 3 cases in total. So there were older women in Switzerland who, as you said, Lizzie, feel more prone to the effects of heat and climate change. There was a French mayor who claimed his government was going to allow their town to go underwater. And that case actually was dismissed because he doesn't live in that town anymore. And therefore, the court said, well, you're not a victim. So we can't actually decide your case. And there was a group of Portuguese teenagers who said that climate inaction was going to alter the whole course of their lives, give them anxiety, other problems. But that was ruled inadmissible as well because it needed to be ruled on by the Portuguese courts first. So although there were 2 other similar cases that were kicked out, they weren't kicked out because they didn't have any merit. They were kicked out for technical reasons. Now, but what's happened here is that the top human rights court in Europe has ruled that Switzerland, and I quote, failed to comply with its duties under the Convention on Human Rights relating to climate change. And that in particular, it had violated the right to respect for private and family life. Now, what do you think, everybody? Do you think that climate change is something that affects your private and family life? Do you think doing something on it or not doing something on it, net zero or not net zero, is going to have an impact on your human rights? Get in the comments and let us know. The court said that there was critical gaps in the country's policies to tackle climate change, including failing to quantify reductions in greenhouse gases, basically not counting what it was doing when things that happen when we burn oil and fossil fuels and coal and gas and stuff like that. Lizzie, how has our government responded to this? Because, this case is in the European Court of Human Rights, which is binding not just on European countries, but on us too, isn't it? And the ECHR comes in for a lot of flack from this particular government. So what have they said anything about this?
Yeah, so the Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, last night tweeted that she was concerned about the ruling, and kind of she made the point that the government has made quite a few times, that elected politicians are better placed to make decisions about policies affecting their citizens. So there's been a kind of long-running issue between the government and the ECHR around particularly Rishi Sunak's attempts to deport failed asylum seekers to Rwanda. The PM has quite often said something. He quite often says things like, "We will not allow a foreign court to make decisions about our policies in the UK," which is a very divisive way of framing it, and often triggers a bit of anger because ECHR isn't a foreign court.
A foreign court that we helped set up.
Exactly. It's not like the government of France is saying to us, this is how the UK should make decisions on asylum policy. The UK helped to establish the ECHR and is part of it. And so that is something that often enrages people. But there's a certain flank of the conservative right who are very anti the ECHR, and there's some sort of echoes of Brexit there, even though they are separate issues. But there's been a lot of back and forth, Rishi Sunak sort of suggesting maybe the UK could leave the ECHR, then stepping back from it again. So I suspect that this ruling will only kind of fuel those calls on that side of the Conservative Party, that maybe the UK should leave the ECHR, because again, net zero is also has some quite divisive elements among the Conservative Party as well. There's been a sort of stepping back from the green policies that Boris Johnson advocated for more when he was leader. And I think this sort of ruling is likely to be quite it's likely to trigger different opinions within the Conservative Party and the government.
Yeah. Now, Mike says right-wing loons. So what you mean, Mike? We'll jump on this as another reason why we must leave the ECHR immediately. There is, like you said, Lizzie, there's a real Venn diagram, isn't there? The big crossover between those politicians that don't like, quotes, foreign courts, which we set up ourselves and abide by, because that's how all our trade agreements are based on the fact we're part of the ECHR, and other countries want to trade with a country which has good human rights, and that's why we get better deals. You leave the ECHR, some of your trade deals collapse, the Northern Ireland Agreement collapses, Good Friday disappears, all this kind of stuff. But there is this Venn diagram between people who don't like human rights, they think they've gone too far, but who are pro-Brexit, who are anti-foreign courts, who also at the same time don't think that climate change is our issue, or that we need to do anything right now, or that it's going to be too expensive. There's the kind of that part of the Conservative Party, or the Conservative vote or base, whatever you want to talk about, is the bit which is in most danger of sort of heading towards reform, isn't it? This insurgent right-wing party we've got at the moment. And so Sunak really needs to kind of, in a way, jump on this and say, well, we're not going to do it. Whereas the Labour Party really needs to say, yes, we are going to do something on this, because that's where their base is going to be. Is there a danger, do you think, Lizzie, that this just becomes that climate change, which a court has just ruled is fundamental to our human rights, suddenly becomes a culture war, and that it is being used to play people one off against another, to suck people into one side of the argument or another, to say what tribe you're in, that you identify as pro-environment or anti-environment, that you're a zealot, you are not a zealot. That's the kind of thing this ruling is going to be used for, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's definitely a risk of that. I think climate change in general in this country is sort of a settled question, in that the government, the majority of voters accept that it's real and it's happening. Man-made climate change is real and it's happening. But there are lots of different opinions on what we should actually be doing about it. And I think the government was the Uxbridge by-election, which obviously the Conservatives sort of made about the expansion of the ULEZ scheme in London, the emissions scheme, and were able to win, which they didn't think they were going to win. That created a sort of wave, which meant that the Conservatives suddenly started stepping back from loads of their green policies. And I think there's a danger that, they're very concerned about people moving to Reform, the party that was born out of Nigel Farage's Brexit party. Farage himself has talked about net zero in the past and about, the government's commitments are too aggressive. So yeah, I do think there is a risk that this becomes a sort of wedge issue in a way, where some people treat, the government treats it, says, oh, we can't go as fast as we wanted to because it's a cost of living issue, or, we can't ask voters to change their lifestyles. And then it becomes more and more divisive as an idea.
Yeah, even though really it doesn't have to be about anyone changing lifestyle very much. It needs to be about governments actually making sure that the lifestyle their voters want is one that is a bit more sustainable, perhaps in some way, with, I don't know, legislation. Which would make corporations act in a better way, because we can't all decide how much plastic is used on the stuff we buy from the supermarket. You can't just buy the non-plastic stuff. You have to kind of have rules set in place that they can't sell the plastic in the first place. Phil says, right-wing loons want to leave the ECHR. That's a good reason to stay. That's one attitude. I think what you're saying, Lizzie, there about most voters, right and left, a lot of Conservative voters believe man-made change to be, climate change to be real and to be happening, and to want measures introduced by their parties to do it. I think this is going to become maybe a wedge issue, but perhaps a niche one. But surely what's going to happen here, because the reason they prosecuted the government in France and Portugal and Switzerland is because other governments are doing the same thing as ours. The wealthy nations are saying, we don't want to tax anybody anymore, and we don't want to change the way we live, and we don't want to not have all the lovely shiny things we have now. We don't really want to say climate change is our fault just because we're the developed, richer nations. So we're not going to do it. And that's happening across the developed world. If the CHR then rules while you're impinging on your citizens' human rights, and you have to do something about this, the Swiss government has said, well, we're going to have to look and see what our new responsibilities might be. What happens if a government, if say there was an election somewhere, as Claire Coutinho says, it's up to elected politicians perhaps. If we had a government that says we don't want to meet net zero for whatever reason, what punishments could there be? If the ECHR really, has already ruled that you're affecting human rights, they've done that with Rwanda before. I mean, things have got tweaked, and, there's new rules got passed through saying Rwanda's a safe country when everyone knows it probably isn't. And all the people who took this case to court, they're normal human beings who've had to crowdfund and put their funds together and pay for a legal team somehow to get there. If a government ignores the ruling, they've got to do it all over again, find thousands more to pay for legal teams to go back to the ECHR to rule against a country again for breaking it. What punishment would there really be if there was a government which decided, well, we're just going to ignore this because our human rights for our citizens involves not paying higher taxes, for example?
Well, I think that, there will always, I think that you might then get into a situation where a country might say, okay, we don't want to be bound by this, we're just going to leave. Because you can leave the ECHR. I think you have to give notice, and there's a period of time, there's a sort of cooling off period or whatever. But I think I'm right in saying that the only people who aren't members of the ECHR are Russia and Belarus, I think. So would the UK really want to be in company with Vladimir Putin's Russia? Do we want to draw a parallel on that? Is that good for Britain's reputation on the world stage? And I think that's why I often think that the government sort of flirts with the idea of saying, oh, we should leave. But then actually a lot of the more sensible members of the Conservative Party, and indeed, officials and members of the government say, actually, really privately, is this something we really want to do? Do we really want to withdraw from the leadership that Britain has shown in Europe? Even if we've left the EU, do we still want to withdraw even further and put ourselves on a parallel with Russia? So, I think that is obviously something that is on the table, but otherwise it just you could end up in endless legal battles, basically, if you don't want to comply with certain things. And then, cases will then go to the Supreme Court in Britain to I think the government's already tied up in endless legal wrangles over Rwanda. I don't know whether they would want to be getting into legal wrangles on this as well.
No, well, some governments, of course, might find that it's politically in their interest to get involved in a battle with quotes, foreign court. We'll have to see how it all pans out. But I think this is going to have a big impact one way or another on how things go forward in the next few years. So it's worth having some little bit of background about it. Now, on to the main story of the day. Yesterday, Mr. Bates took on the Post Office yet again when he appeared at the public inquiry. Now, in case you've been under a rock, this is Alan Bates, a sub-postmaster sucked into the scandal of post office software wrongly totting up the day's takings, which led to the wrongful prosecution of thousands of people for theft and fraud, when the post office bosses knew apparently all along all those cases were unsafe. We've got a short clip of him at the inquiry yesterday. Here it is.
They're an atrocious organisation. They need disbanding, it needs removing, it needs building up again from the ground floor. And as I've been quoted quite commonly, the whole of the postal service nowadays, it's a dead duck. It's beyond saving, and to be quite fair, it needs to be sold to someone like Amazon. It needs a real big injection of money, and I think that can only happen coming in from outside. Otherwise, it's just going to be a bugbear for the government for the years to come.
Now, it's been pretty excoriating, it would seem, at least about the post office and its likelihood of surviving, never mind what it did to sub-postmasters. Now, Mr. Bates there set up a campaign group, and his leadership was lionised by an ITV drama, which made him the focus of the fight for justice. Lizzie, this was his chance, 23 years after the scandal started, to really land one on the post office and apportion blame for what they had done. Did he do that?
Yeah, I think it had obviously been a long time coming, and the significance of his evidence meant that he had an entire day of questions at the inquiry, whereas lots of other people have much shorter stints. Obviously, Alan Bates's story has been well told, and he's given lots of interviews and he's been campaigning for a long time. So, there were things about it that were familiar, though his testimony was very powerful. But I think there were lots of good details in there that I certainly hadn't heard before. There were the inquiry also was able to get to things like email chains from post office bosses sort of saying, we've got to get rid of Bates, he's unmanageable. When just before he was sacked, there was some things about sort of post office lawyers saying that what they knew and when, and them basically admitting it was a bad PR move, certain things. So I think it was really good to kind of get into some of the detail, and it sets us up for the next I think 2-3 months, where the post office inquiry is really going to get to the heart of it now, where there's going to be a number of senior bosses from both the post office and Fujitsu, the Japanese company that developed the software that was faulty, basically, the Horizon software. So I think there's a few former chief executives on this week. And then next month, we've got Paula Venables, the former chief executive, who has become a real kind of focal point for a lot of the anger. She's giving evidence for 3 days in May about what she knew. She was chief executive between 2012 and 2019. So she sort of oversaw the point where the Alan Bates and the 554 other postmasters took legal action against the post office, and she was in charge when the post office decided to contest that legal action. And what's been quite interesting recently is there's been a lot of leaked recordings coming out, letters, that sort of thing, basically suggesting that the post office was aware as far back as 2013 that there were problems with the Horizon software, that it was causing issues, that it could be accessed remotely by engineers from Fujitsu's headquarters, which was a key thing that they denied endlessly. And so we're now looking at a situation when Paula Venables is up, is did the post office knowingly mislead Parliament, mislead government, and engage in legal action when they knew that their arguments were false?
Yeah, and tell people things which ended up being repeated in court, which were just not true. Mike says, is there an expected end date on this inquiry? Will the government be hoping to push any compensation payments onto the next administration? I think in answer to your last question, yes, Mike, yes, because every compensation payment that's floating around at the moment, there's quite a few, is going to be pushed on. The expected end date, I think, is sometime, isn't it next year, Lizzie?
Yeah, the evidence, the final phase of the inquiry will take evidence in the autumn. So they're sort of estimating it will end, I think it starts in September. So I suspect we may get the report and the recommendations next year.
Yeah, it's a little bit wild and good. So one of the things that Alan Bates said, it's described on the front page of the Mirror today, he described the post office as thugs in suits. He said that the post office limited has spent the entire period, which is 2 decades, pretty much, at least a decade since Paula Venables was in charge, the entire period denying, lying, defending, attempting to discredit and silence me. And it's the kind of thing that it's affected thousands of people in this case. I don't really know if inspired's the right word, but it's certainly infected with rage millions of others, I think it's safe to say. And today's letters page in the Mirror is a case in point. If you have a copy, I suggest trying to read through some of these. So we've got Steve from Milton Keynes. Am I the only one who's deeply puzzled by the lack of court proceedings against Paula Venables and other senior post office and Fujitsu executives? The long-standing, ever-growing dossier of prima facie evidence surely warrants arrests. There's someone from Slough in Berkshire who says, I was watching an interview on BBC Breakfast with Jess Cole, a sub-postmistress who was a victim of the Horizon scandal. I thought I couldn't get shocked by revelations anymore, but Jess emotionally revealed on live TV that while she was in hospital suffering with severe trauma and mental health breakdowns directly caused by the post office, they sent their own doctors in to find out if she was faking it. That they couldn't even trust the clinical diagnosis of the NHS doctors who were treating her. Ronnie from Norwich says, now documents have proved bosses and lawyers knew of the issues. They should be investigated by the police. I mean, these letters are just a stream of demands from the public, as we've seen as well after the ITV drama, that someone's held to account, that there is this sense, isn't there, that there must have been a crime committed here somewhere because it's so wrong, whether it's perjury, whether it's false accounting. You know, covering your own backside, unfortunately, isn't a criminal offence at the moment. But since this drama was aired and these tape conversations have been leaked, it does seem that someone really knew that the crimes that were being prosecuted by the post office itself weren't really... They weren't something that could really be substantiated safely in criminal terms. And, you know, if you could remotely access those computer systems, it would have been possible to reverse engineer the convictions even. Is this, Lizzie, do you think this is going to lead to where people think it should, that it will get to a court case at any point?
I think it's certainly possible. The issue at the moment is... everyone's sort of waiting for the inquiry to end, which is good in the sense that it is good for the inquiry to do its job to establish the evidence that it's getting and all of that without the interference, external interference. But a number of MPs that I've spoken to about this, including the Labour MP Kevin Jones, who's been campaigning on this for a long time and sits on the Compensation Advisory Board, they are starting to say, we don't understand why there aren't prosecutions already. Why do we have to wait for the inquiry? This is getting ridiculous. And I think there's some sympathy with that argument. The government says the inquiry needs to finish first and then let's see. But the Post Office Minister, Kevin Hollinbrake, has been saying for a while now that he thinks that those guilty should be sent to prison. And the Met Police began an investigation, I think in 2020, where they are looking at sort of, as far as I understand it, possible offences of fraud and perverting the course of justice. But we don't know a lot about that inquiry and who's actually being looked at. But I suspect if the inquiry finds that, you know, people did know, post office bosses did know that the software was faulty and that these prosecutions were unsound, that people should be in court. And I hope that, you know, that the postmasters will get that justice, because I think that's what Alan Bates and so many of them keep saying. You know, the compensation is one thing. Yes, people's lives were ruined, but like people need to be held to account for this. Like the money won't take back the time that people have lost, the damage to their reputations. Lots of people have died without ever having their names cleared. Like somebody needs to, you know, multiple people perhaps need to be held accountable for that.
Yeah. That's the catharsis, isn't it? If there's been an injustice, there has to be a release and a correction, a balance in the other way, some way. But I dare say, if all those people, and I'm sure there are viewers out there saying, yes, there should be people arrested, why aren't they in clink already? If we had that situation, and so let's say Paula Venel's got arrested for something tomorrow, she wouldn't be giving evidence at the public inquiry, because her lawyers and everything else would just say, well, you can't, because you're going to interfere and significantly affect a future court case. Once criminal proceedings start, they become active. There's some things you can't do in this country, and you have to let justice run its course. So if there's the public inquiry would end up having to go on ice, I suspect, for a while to let convictions and court cases sort of play out. And that would mean people couldn't give evidence to the public inquiry. It would mean any evidence they did give would be sort of extra lawyered and everything else. And so that's probably why the inquiry is heading on before there's any criminal cases, because otherwise, if it was the other way around, we'd be going, well, why can't the inquiry get to the bottom of this? And why is it all on ice just to wait for, 3 years or something for a case to come to court? So this is probably the best way of doing it, even though it's not necessarily perfect. Dare say, well, we'll all be there waiting when the cuffs finally go on somebody. I'm sure they will at some point. Now, we have managed to find some good news in the world for you. So actually, it's a good picture. And here it is. Now, look at that. Sorry, I'm just grinning, just looking at this photograph. Now, let's be honest here, this is just an excuse to use a photograph of golden retriever puppies. But it's also possibly the happiest picture in the paper today, and I wanted to share it with you. For the benefit of those listening on the podcast, we've got a photograph here filling a whole page. Standing up at the back are 4 women who work for the Guide Dogs charity. Each of them are holding an incredibly cute, chubby, fluffy golden retriever puppy who just looks like a bundle of love. And on front of them on the grass, rolling on his back in the traditional accepted manner of a delighted dog, is Trigger, who has actually fathered. He's a 9-year-old stud dog, and he has fathered not only the 4 in the picture, Triglets as they're known, but 320 puppies who are going to go on to be guide dogs and help those with sight loss when they grow up. And he's now finally retiring from the field of romance. He's done his bit. He's had a back scratch on the grass here, and he's retiring. Lizzie, aside from the absolute joy I think we can all feel just looking at how happy Trigger is and how cute his little Triglets are, is this proof that the secret to lifelong happiness might just be a lot of, let's say, romantic success?
I think it's been a success for Trigger. So, I thought you were going to say just being surrounded by golden retrievers, which
yes,
I also think would be a very good happy and successful life.
Yeah, I think if you happen to be a veterinary nurse at the Guide Dogs charity, you are a very happy person. There's nothing wrong in your life at all. And Trigger's obviously had a great time. He's now retiring to live with the volunteer who's looked after him for the past 7 years or so, and hopefully, rest his man parts a bit, because they've been very busy. But he's done a good job, and he's just, if you can find those pictures today, everybody, please just look them up, because they will just make you feel happy. No matter what else is going on in the world, how many other injustices you feel there may be that need dealing with, Trigger will make it all better for you. He really will. Now, before we go, I just want to say thank you to the producer behind the scenes, Sam. He is leaving on Friday, and he's going to go off traveling, the poor wee lad. Now, since he has been doing this show, since we lost Ed a little while ago, he has come without complaint to Downing Street to deal with my nuclear test veterans. He has dealt with Keir Starmer. He has been to the Labour conference. He's been ordered around by me. He's been an absolute joy to work with. And we're very sorry to see you go. So thank you very much, Sam, for all you've done. No one who watches this show gets to see it because it just happens smoothly behind the scenes. But without him and all the others like him as well who work, it would be impossible to do. So we're very sorry that you're off, but have a great time traveling and come back safe and sound, please. Thank you everyone for listening and taking part. We will see you again on Monday. Everyone's back to work, everyone's back to school, and we will have another edition of the News Agenda because they'll be back in Westminster and they'll be up to it again. If you're listening to us on podcast, please leave us a review so other people can find us. Until next week, stay safe, take care, tatty bye.